I can remember opening up my school history textbook and coming across a photo that still sticks with me to this day. It was of a man sat in the middle of the street, literally burning alive. We did not cover the topic, but I would take whatever chance I could to read about the man I came to know as Thich Quang Duc, the burning monk. His story is one that is perhaps not well known, but it is a story important to give the background context of the state of South Vietnam before the American military intervention in the region. Duc was a Mahayana Buddhist monk, born in 1897 in French Indochina, with a birth name Lam Van Tuc. At the time, this was the region of Lao, Cambodia, and parts of Vietnam. At the age of 7, the young boy left his home to study Buddhism. At the time, there was a push by the colonial powers to convert the population to Catholicism, but clearly, this did not impact him. By the age of 20, he had become a monk, gaining the Dharma name Thich Quang Duc. He set about carrying out the duties you would expect of a Buddhist monk, travelling, preaching, and establishing many temples. In 1954, the French colonial forces were defeated in the First Indochina War. Following the Geneva Conference in April of 1954, a split between North and South Vietnam was clearly drawn. There was the communist North-backed China and the nationalist South backed by the United States of America. The Geneva Accords were not signed by South Vietnam or the United States, fearful of the communist North spreading their influence and being able to succeed in the proposed elections. South Vietnam was established as a separate state, headed by the Catholic minority under No D Jim. Jim's policies greatly favoured Catholics to the detriment of the majority Buddhist population. This included forced conversions, limited opportunity for governmental and military jobs, and even persecution by private armies headed by Catholic priests. Any Buddhist religious displays required approval from the state, whilst Catholic displays were freely permitted. In May of 1963, Buddhists were banned from displaying flags to celebrate the birthday of their spiritual leader, Gautama Buddha. This, whilst the Vatican flag was flown at all major events and public spaces. On the 8th of May 1963, a protest of 3,000 people defied the ban of the Buddhist flags and marched through the Perfume River, making their way to Du Dam Temple near Hue. Placards were written in both Vietnamese and English for the benefit of the Western observers, decrying religious persecution. The protesters planned to move into the city and congregate in front of the government-controlled radio station, but the South Vietnamese army was deployed to break up the protest. Shots were fired directly into the crowd and grenades were thrown into the mass of protesters. Armoured personnel carriers pushed forward to scatter the protesters and crushed 2 children to death. In the end, 9 people, including the 2 children, were murdered. Diem attempted to put the blame on the North Vietnamese Viet Cong and attempted to suppress the truth, which included arresting a doctor who did not corroborate the government's version of events as to the cause of deaths. The US officials in the region attempted to claim that both parties were at fault, but in the end, these comments turned to support Jim's forces. Buddhist leaders drafted a 5-point plan for religious freedoms and continued to protest against the unfair treatment of Buddhists, with an ever-increasing number of people joining the more frequent protests. On the 11th of June 1963, a peaceful protest began of some 400 Buddhist monks and nuns. This was held outside of the Cambodian embassy in Saigon. Foreign press had been notified that this was to be a very important protest, but only few attended, including Malcolm Brown. Duc arrived at the protest by car and sat in the middle of a busy intersection, and he sat in the lotus position. The monk who had arrived with him then poured gasoline over the sitting monk. Duc then lit himself ablaze, not making a sound as he burned to death. The crowd were completely stunned. Malcolm Brown began to capture some photographs that are beyond shocking. After a few minutes, Duc's body was covered with yellow cloth and taken away. His last words before his self-immolation were in a letter addressed to Jim, and it read, "Before closing my eyes and moving towards the vision of the Buddha, I respectfully plead to the President to take a mind of compassion towards the people of the nation and implement religious equality to maintain the strength of the homeland eternally. I call the venerables, reverends, members of the Sangha, and the lay Buddhists to organize in solidarity to make sacrifices to protect Buddhism." Jim's response was manic. He accused Malcolm Brown of bribing Duc in order to capture a good photograph, or that Duc had been drugged and forced to commit suicide. Many more self-immolations were carried out as protests continued and escalated. The response from the United States was of great shock as they questioned their role in supporting Jim, and whether there was a better way to deal with their Cold War goals and stopping the spread of communism. Many in the United States drew parallels to Christian martyrs. President JFK was quoted as saying just 2 words in response to seeing the photograph: Jesus Christ. In July of 1963, Diem was murdered following a coup by Vietnamese nationalists and the military. Whilst the coup did not gain the direct American backing, the Americans were no longer willing to support Diem and gave tacit support for the action. This was the first of a series of military coups that were seen to weaken the South's ability to repel the North Vietnamese communists, which was a favour factor in the American military intervention. Duc's legacy could be seen as the start of the path to the Vietnam War. His self-immolation shocked the world and spelled the end for Jim's reign. His protest was later emulated by some anti-war activists in protest against the war in Vietnam. Duc's intact heart became a religious relic, seen as evidence of his compassion. Duc's legacy is one of the power of individual protest, through one that cost him his life. It is an example of the desperate lengths that people will go into combating injustice. It is hard not to be moved by Duc's actions, watching him give everything in the hopes of a tomorrow that he would never see.